My name is Harold Avery Croft. I held master's papers for vessels up to 8,000 gross tons, issued by the United States Merchant Marine, validated in 1942 and renewed without condition in every subsequent year through 1958. I am giving this deposition voluntarily, though I will say plainly that voluntary is a word I use with some reservation, because the alternative was to allow the inquest to proceed on the basis of the boatswain's written statement alone, and that statement, while accurate in its outline, does not account for the decisions made on the bridge. Those decisions were mine. The accounting for them should come from me. I will answer every question this panel puts to me. I will not speculate beyond what I observed, and I will identify clearly when I am drawing an inference rather than reporting a fact. I have been at sea for 19 years. I do not believe in sea monsters. I am asking this panel to hold that statement alongside everything else I am about to say, and to determine for themselves what they make of the distance between the two. The events I am describing occurred between the 14th and the 16th of October 1959, aboard the MV Carrick Sound, a general cargo freighter of 4,200 gross tons, running under contract to Pacific Consolidated Freight on the supply route between Honolulu, Hawaii, and Colonia in the Caroline Islands. The vessel was in sound mechanical condition. The crew numbered 23 men. At the conclusion of the voyage, 22 men returned to Honolulu. The 23rd was Raymond Fitch Delacroix, my first mate, age 34, of New Orleans, Louisiana. He had sailed with me for 6 years. His wife is named Margaret. His daughters are named Claire and Iris. They were 5 and 3 years old respectively at the time of his death. I want those names in this record. I want them to be the first thing this panel reads back when they review the transcript. What follows is my account of how Raymond Delacroix died, and of the decision I made 14 minutes before he died that I believe contributed directly to his death. I am not asking for absolution. I am providing an accounting. I will begin at the beginning. The Carrick Sound departed Honolulu at 6:40 in the morning on the 13th of October, 1959, carrying a mixed cargo of canned goods, lumber, construction aggregate, medical supplies, and approximately 40 tons of perishable produce in 2 refrigerated holds. The weather was clear. The sea was running light swells from the northwest, 2 to 3 feet, consistent with the forecast. I had made this run 11 times in the preceding 3 years. It was, by every professional measure, a routine voyage. I should note for the record that there are 2 details from the departure that I have considered since, and I want to place them here precisely because they are the kind of details a man can manufacture in hindsight, and I want to be on record that I noticed them at the time. The first is that the water temperature, logged by the engineer on deck watch, dropped by 4 degrees Fahrenheit in a single hour during the afternoon of the 13th, approximately 160 miles southwest of Honolulu. We were not near any known cold current upwelling zone. The engineer, whose name was Tomas Brennan, logged it as anomalous and moved on. The second detail is that the sonar trace, which I was not monitoring closely because the route was familiar and the water was open ocean with no navigational hazards charted in the area, showed a large diffuse return at depth sometime during the night of the 13th. A return I reviewed 3 days later in Honolulu with a man from the Naval Hydrographic Office who told me it was consistent with a deep scattering layer, which is a biological phenomenon, dense aggregations of marine organisms that can produce false bottom readings on certain sonar frequencies. He was not wrong that it was consistent with that explanation. He was also not wrong that the return was somewhat large for a scattering layer at that depth, and that it was moving in our direction. He offered no further comment on those qualifications, and I did not press him at the time, because at the time I was still hoping there was a clean explanation for all of it. There was not a clean explanation. The morning of the 14th was warm, which I note because I want to establish the baseline of how the air and the deck felt under normal conditions on that voyage, so that what I describe later can be understood against it. The Pacific in October at that latitude runs warm. The deck plating holds heat from midday through the late afternoon. Standing on the bridge deck with the door open, there is a reliable southwesterly that carries moisture, and the faint, clean smell of deep ocean, which is not the same as the smell of shallow coastal water. I know that smell. I know what warm feels like on a ship running in open sea. I am establishing this because what I am about to describe is a physical sensation, a change in temperature, and a change in pressure transmitted through the deck and the hull, and I want this panel to understand that I was in a state I can only describe as baseline. I was not cold. I was not anxious. I was not primed to interpret anything abnormally. I was a man on a familiar route on a calm morning. The first event occurred at approximately 14 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, on the 14th of October. I was on the bridge. Brennan was below, running a routine check on the refrigeration units. The helmsman, a man named Sobrero who had been with the vessel for 8 months, and who I regarded as competent and steady, was at the wheel. There were 3 other deckhands on watch rotation, none of them immediately visible to me from the bridge. The sea was calm. I had the log open on the chart table and was making routine notations. The sensation began in my feet. I want to be very careful about how I describe this. It was not a vibration. The Carrick Sounds engine, a 6-cylinder Burmeister and Wayne diesel, produces a vibration that I know by feel as well as I know my own heartbeat. This was not that. This was a compression, a slow rolling pressure that moved upward through the deck plating, through the soles of my boots, through my legs, and settled in my chest. It lasted perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. My first thought was that we had struck something, a submerged container, a piece of floating debris large enough to produce a sympathetic resonance through the hull. I checked the helm readout. No deviation. I checked the engine telegraph. Normal. I stepped to the bridge wing and looked at the waterline on the port side. The water was flat. There was no visible disturbance. I logged it as follows. 14 hours. Unexplained hull resonance. No cause identified. Sea conditions calm. No course or speed deviation noted. I radioed Brennan and asked if anything had shifted in the holds, or if the engine room had produced any unusual output. He said no on both counts, and asked if I wanted him on deck. I told him not yet. I will tell this panel what I thought at the time. I thought we had passed through a pressure differential associated with a submarine, a military vessel running at depth, because the United States Navy and the navies of several other nations conducted regular operations in that part of the Pacific, and submarine propulsion systems can produce hull resonance in surface vessels they pass beneath at certain speeds and depths. It was an unusual sensation, but it had an available explanation, and I am a man who reaches for available explanations. That is my professional disposition. It is also, I now understand, the disposition that cost me 14 minutes on the 16th. The second event occurred at 17 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, 3 hours and 3 minutes after the first. I will not catalogue every physical sensation in the same detail for each event. I will say that the second event was stronger. The compression moved through the hull with enough force that Sobrero said aloud, without being asked, that he felt something wrong in the wheel. Not a mechanical fault, he said, but a feeling in the wheel, a kind of resistance that was not mechanical. The deck moved. Not violently, not enough to knock anything from a surface, but I felt it shift under my feet, the way a deck shifts in a beam sea. Except that we were not in a beam sea. The ocean was flat and there was no wind. I came to the bridge wing again, and this time I saw something. The water on the starboard side of the vessel was displaced. The waterline had climbed. Not dramatically, perhaps 3 inches, 4 at the most, but it was uniform along the visible length of the hull, as though something very large and very close beneath the surface was pushing water aside as it moved. The displacement ran forward of the bow and aft of the stern simultaneously, and that is the detail that stopped me where I stood on the bridge wing with my hand on the rail. The displacement was longer than the ship. The Carrick Sound measured 214 feet from stem to stern. The waterline displacement I observed extended beyond the bow by what I estimated to be 30 to 40 feet, and beyond the stern by a comparable distance. That is a rough estimate, and I acknowledge it as such. But the displacement was longer than my ship. I stood on the bridge wing for approximately 90 seconds watching it, and in that time the displacement did not diminish. Whatever was producing it was maintaining our speed and our heading precisely. Then it was gone. The waterline dropped back to normal. The ocean was flat. I called Brennan to the bridge, and I described what I had seen. Brennan was 47 years old and had worked marine engineering for 22 years. He was not a man who elaborated unnecessarily. He listened to my description without interrupting, and when I was finished he said he wanted to go below and run a visual inspection of the hull plating from the bilge access points, which are the lowest accessible points on the interior of the vessel, and I said yes. He came back 20 minutes later and told me that the plating was showing a slight inward distortion on the starboard bilge strake between frames 19 and 23, a section of hull approximately 16 feet in length, and that the distortion was recent, meaning the metal was not fatigued or corroded, but had been pushed. He used that word, pushed. He said it was as though something had pressed against the exterior of the hull, with enough force to deform the plating inward by approximately a quarter inch over that section. I logged this as structural anomaly, possible submarine contact, starboard bilge strake, frames 19 through 23, distortion noted, cause unknown, to be inspected in dry dock. I did not alter course. I want the panel to have that fact clearly. At 5:30 in the afternoon on the 14th of October, with 2 documented hull pressure events in 3 hours and a measurable inward distortion in my bilge strake, I maintained course and speed. I made this decision because I still had an available explanation, submarine contact, and because the deviation required to reach the nearest alternate port, which would have been Guam, represented a fuel and schedule cost that I calculated as disproportionate to what I had logged. I also made this decision because I did not want to file an incident report that described pressure waves and waterline displacement and tell the shipping company and the Maritime Authority that I had turned a 4,000-ton freighter off its contracted route because the ocean felt wrong. That decision reflects poorly on my judgment. I am stating that here without qualification. At 6:40 in the evening, while the deck crew was rigging the cargo net over the starboard rail in preparation for the Colonia offload, which was standard practice, begun the day before arrival to save time in port, the bosun came to the bridge. The bosun's name was Ernesto Macapagal. He was 51 years old, originally from Cebu in the Philippines, and he had been working blue water cargo vessels since he was 19. He was not a man who came to the bridge unnecessarily. In 6 years of sailing together, he had come to the bridge uninvited perhaps 3 times, and each time he had been correct that the matter required my attention. I want this panel to understand the weight I placed on his judgment before I explain that I did not take his advice. Macapagal stood in the doorway of the bridge. He did not come all the way in. He said that he had felt both of the pressure events below decks, that the second one had moved a toolbox off a secured shelf in the bosun's locker, and that he wanted to take the cargo net back in for the night. I asked him why, specifically. He said that he did not know what was out there, but that it was very large, and that it had come back, and that anything that large moving at depth near a ship in open ocean had no reason to be near a ship in open ocean unless it was interested in the ship, and that a cargo net hanging over the side in 30 feet of water in the dark was not something he wanted hanging over the side. I asked him if he was telling me there was something in the water large enough to interact with a 4,000-ton vessel. He said yes. I told him that the structural distortion and the pressure events were most likely the result of submarine activity, and that I was monitoring the situation. I told him to keep the net rigged, but to pull it to deck level, out of the water, until morning, as a precaution. Macapagal looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Captain, pull the net in, all the way." I said, "Deck level, Ernesto. That is what we will do." He nodded and went back to his crew. The net was raised to approximately 4 feet above the waterline, which is deck level at the stern, and secured to the starboard rail cleats. It was not pulled aboard. It was not stowed. It was hanging against the hull in 4 feet of clear space above the water, and I want the panel to note that 4 feet above the waterline on a calm sea is a very different condition from 4 feet above the waterline in the event of any significant surface disturbance. That evening, I ate dinner in the mess with Delacroix and Brennan. Delacroix had not been on deck during either pressure event and had only heard my account of the waterline displacement. He was a methodical man, Delacroix, and his method was to work from what he could verify. He said he wanted to look at the sonar trace from the afternoon, and he spent 2 hours after dinner going over the paper record with a ruler. He came to my cabin at 10 in the evening and laid the trace out on my desk. There was a return on the trace that he had measured. It appeared at the time of the first pressure event and again at the time of the second, and it was deep, he said, 300 feet or more at first. Shallower on the second pass, perhaps 150 feet. The return was diffuse at the edges and dense at its center, and at its widest point it measured, on the paper trace, considerably wider than the vessel. Delacroix was a methodical man, and he said, methodically, that it could be a scattering layer artifact, that it could be a submarine running with a noisy propeller, that it could be a whale or a pod of whales in close formation. He laid out these options without emphasis, the way he always reasoned through a problem, giving each possibility its fair proportion. Then he rolled the trace and put it in his jacket pocket and said that he was going to sleep and that we would watch the sonar carefully in the morning. He said, before he left my cabin, "Whatever it is, it knows where we are." I did not sleep well that night. I will acknowledge that plainly. I lay in my bunk and I thought about the pressure in my chest when the second event hit, the way it had moved upward from the deck, like a wave of cold pushing through metal and wood and leather and skin, and I thought about the displacement line running past my bow and past my stern simultaneously, and I thought about what Macapagal had said about anything that large, having no reason to be near a ship unless it was interested in the ship. The cold in my chest, when I thought about it in the dark of my cabin, was not a memory of warmth interrupted. It was the feeling of something very cold and very large, passing close beneath me, in water that should not be that cold, in a part of the ocean where the cold had no business being. I want to return to the temperature record, because I consider it important evidence. Brennan's logs show that water temperature at the hull thermometer dropped 6 degrees Fahrenheit between the time of the first pressure event and 1 hour after the second. The ambient air temperature did not change. The engine cooling system was functioning normally. The 6-degree drop at the hull thermometer represents a localized cold event at the waterline, which is consistent with a very large mass of cold water being displaced upward from depth, which is what happens when a very large animal rises from deep cold water toward the surface. I am not stating this as a conclusion. I am stating it as a physical mechanism that is consistent with the temperature record and with the other observations. At 3:17 in the morning, on the 15th of October, the third event occurred. This one woke the crew. I was already awake. I had been on the bridge since 2 in the morning, because I could not sleep, and because I wanted to watch the sonar trace personally. The sea was still calm. There was no moon. The stars were clear and the horizon was defined, and the water was black and flat and gave back the starlight in a long, trembling path off the port bow. Standing on the bridge in the dark with the door open, the air was warm, as it should be, and the ocean smell was clean, salt and open water and nothing else. The pressure began at exactly 3:17 by my watch. It started low, below my feet, in the soles of my boots, and it built. It did not arrive as a single wave the way the first 2 events had. It built. It rose through the deck, plating like something tightening, like the feeling before a very loud sound, the physical precursor that is not yet sound, but is already happening in your body. And it kept building, and the deck moved under my feet, a definite lateral shift, perhaps an inch, and the chart table rattled, and Sobrero, who was at the wheel, said something in Tagalog that I do not speak but whose meaning was apparent from his face. The sonar lit. The Return appeared at approximately 200 feet directly beneath us, and it was moving upward, and it was large. On the paper trace, it was the widest Return I had ever seen on that instrument, and I had been reading sonar traces for 17 years. It was wider than the vessel, and it was rising, and it was centered exactly on our position, and the compression in the hull was no longer a pressure wave. It was a sustained force, like being inside a bell that was being rung, and the cold was coming through the hull now, not just at the waterline but through the deck plating itself, a radiating cold that I felt on the bottom of my feet through my boots, that I felt on my hands where I had them braced against the chart table. Men came to the deck. I could hear them below, voices, feet on the metal stairs. Brennan came to the bridge at a run and looked at the sonar and said one word, which was not a word I will repeat in this deposition, but which expressed his assessment of the situation accurately. The sonar Return peaked at approximately 70 feet below the keel, and then it began to move forward. Whatever it was, it passed beneath us from stern to bow, moving at our speed and then faster, and as it passed, the waterline rose on the starboard side, not 3 or 4 inches this time, but 6 inches, 7. The ocean climbing the hull as though the sea itself was tilting, and the deck shifted, not a vibration but a physical movement of the vessel, a 3 or 4 degree heel to port, as the starboard side was lifted fractionally by the water being displaced, and men on deck grabbed rails and each other, and I heard one of the deckhands shout. Then it was forward of us. The sonar Return moved ahead of the bow and diminished, deepening as it went, and the hull settled and the cold receded, and the deck was still again, and the ocean was flat, and the men on deck were standing in a group at the port rail looking forward into the dark, as though they expected to see something, which they did not. I stood on the bridge for 3 minutes without speaking. Then I picked up the radio handset and called Delacroix to the bridge. Delacroix came up in 2 minutes, his jacket on over his undershirt, the sonar trace from the evening before still in his jacket pocket, because he had gone to sleep with his jacket on the chair beside his bunk the way he always did. He came to the bridge and looked at the sonar trace running on the machine, and he watched it for 30 seconds without saying anything. Then he said, "How deep?" I said, 70 feet at closest approach. It came up from below 200. He looked at the trace a moment longer. "It's still there." He was right. The Return had not disappeared from the trace. It had deepened and moved forward, but it was still present on the screen, a diffuse mass at depth, holding approximately 500 yards ahead of the bow, which at our current speed was slightly faster than us. Not much. Just slightly. It was staying ahead of us at a distance of 500 yards and holding that distance. I ordered a speed reduction, 10 knots down to 6. The Return slowed. It maintained the 500-yard lead. I ordered a course alteration of 30 degrees to port. The Return moved to match. In less than 4 minutes, it had repositioned to the 500-yard lead position on the new heading. I stood at the sonar screen and watched this, and I will not describe to this panel what I felt, because what I felt is not evidence. What is evidence is what I did next, which was to order a course alteration of 30 degrees to starboard, back toward the original heading but not quite, and the Return moved again and held its position. It was leading us. I want to be precise about that. Not following. Leading. It was positioned ahead of the vessel, and it was maintaining that position through our speed changes and our course changes, which means it was monitoring our course and speed, and adjusting accordingly, which means it had awareness of us as a moving object, and was actively relating its movement to ours. I have never used the word intelligence in a maritime incident report in 19 years. I am not going to use it now. What I will say is that the behavior I observed was purposeful and responsive, and that purposeful and responsive behavior in an animal of the size indicated by that sonar Return is, in my professional assessment, the most alarming thing I have ever observed in 19 years at sea. At 4 in the morning, I convened Delacroix, Brennan, and Macapagal in my cabin. I spread the chart on my desk, and I showed them our position, and I told them what I had seen on the sonar since 3:17. I told them about the sonar return leading us and matching our course changes. I told them about the hull temperature data. I told them about the 3-degree heel to port when the thing passed beneath us. Macapagal said nothing for a long time. Then he asked how wide the sonar return was at its widest point. I told him that at the peak of the closest approach, it had been approximately 50 to 60 feet wide on the trace, which at the scale of our instrument corresponded to a real-world measurement of somewhere between 60 and 80 feet. Macapagal looked at the chart. Our vessel was 214 feet long and 32 feet at the beam. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Delacroix said that the return could be a pod of whales moving in close formation, and that the sonar resolution at depth was not reliable enough to distinguish individual animals from a single mass return. He said this carefully and without insistence. The way he said things he himself was not entirely convinced by. He said that regardless of the cause, a significant return of unknown nature was tracking us, and that we should consider a course deviation toward the nearest port. Brennan said that the bilge-strake deformation he had found was not caused by whales in any formation he was aware of, and that whatever had pushed his hull plating a quarter-inch inward over 16 feet of frame section had done it with the kind of sustained lateral force that a school of whales would not produce, and that a submarine would not produce, and that he wanted to know what it was before he gave an opinion on what to do about it. I told them what I had decided before I called them in. We would increase speed to maximum continuous, which on the Carrick Sound was 14 knots, and we would deviate course 20 degrees to the northeast, which would add approximately 9 hours to our transit, but would take us into shallower water along the edge of the Caroline Ridge, where whatever was beneath us, if it was a deep-water animal, might not follow. I told them I was going to radio Honolulu and file an incident report and request naval hydrographic guidance. I told Macapagal to get the cargo net aboard, all the way aboard, not deck level, stowed and secured. Macapagal looked at me with the expression of a man who has been telling his captain something for several hours and has finally been heard. I said, "I know, Ernesto." He went to get the net. This is the point in my account where I must introduce a fact that reflects poorly on me, and I will introduce it plainly. The net was not fully stowed by the time the fourth event occurred. I had ordered Macapagal to get it aboard, and he had begun the process. But the net was a heavy working cargo net, 30 feet by 40 feet, made of thick hemp cord with steel clip rings, and bringing it fully aboard in the dark with a 4-man crew was a task that required time. Macapagal had it off the cleats and was rigging the hoist when the fourth event hit at 4:47 in the morning. This event was different from the previous 3. The previous 3 had been compression waves, pressure events transmitted through the hull, felt in the body before they were heard. The fourth event began that way, the familiar tightening in the soles of my feet, the cold rising through the deck, but it did not peak and pass. It kept building, and it kept building past the point the third event had reached, and I had to brace against the chart table with both arms, and the chart table moved, and the sonar return was directly beneath us, not ahead, not astern, beneath us, and it was at 30 feet, not 70, 30 feet below our keel, and the sonar technician, a young man named Ariola, who was 22 years old and who had been manning the equipment since I ordered him to at 4 in the morning, made a sound that I cannot describe as anything other than physical distress, not fear, but the sound a man makes when his body is under pressure it was not designed to bear. The Carrick Sound lifted. Not much. I want to be precise. I estimate the starboard side rose 8 to 10 inches, and the vessel heeled to port by approximately 5 degrees. This was not a wave effect. The sea was still flat. This was displacement of water from a mass beneath us, a mass close enough to the keel that its movement through the water was physically lifting the hull on the starboard side. I felt it in my knees and in my hips, the floor tilting under me, the way a floor tilts in a building when something structural shifts, and I heard metal groan somewhere below decks, and then the sonar return moved forward again, and the vessel settled, and the cold dropped away from the deck plating, and the floor was flat again. I went to the bridge wing. The night was still dark, but the starlight was bright enough that the surface of the water was visible as far as the bow. On the starboard side, the water was disturbed. Not violently, not a roil or a break, but a long, slow, circular movement of the surface. The kind of surface disturbance that a very large object makes when it moves through water at shallow depth. The water rotating slowly as the mass beneath it displaces and then resettles. The circular movement was centered slightly forward of amidships, and it extended to a diameter I estimated at 80 to 100 feet. Then, at the edge of the disturbed water, approximately 60 feet off the starboard rail, something broke the surface. Not a body, not a head or a fin, a shape, a dark shape, backlit by the starlight from below the water, a pale phosphorescent outline beneath the surface that resolved for 3, perhaps 4 seconds into a form I can only describe as follows. A broad, flat, enormously wide shape moving slowly from stern to bow at the surface, its leading edge preceding the disturbed water and its trailing edge within it. And the width of the shape from the visible port limit to where it disappeared under the keel was wider than the beam of my vessel, which is 32 feet. I watched it for 4 seconds. Then it was gone. The water settled. I stood on the bridge wing for 30 seconds. Then I went inside and picked up the intercom and told Macapagal to get the net aboard now, immediately, and to use every man he had on it. He said he was already doing it. It took 12 minutes to get the net the rest of the way aboard. The fifth event occurred 14 minutes after the fourth. In those 14 minutes, the following things happened. I called Delacroix to the bridge and told him I needed him at the starboard rail to observe. He came up at a run. I increased speed to full, all 14 knots, and I altered course 20 degrees northeast as I had planned. Brennan, who had gone below during the fourth event, radioed up to say that the bilge strake deformation had worsened, that the metal was now bowed inward by close to half an inch over an extended section, and that he was concerned about the integrity of the plating. I radioed Honolulu on the emergency frequency and transmitted a position report with a notation that we were experiencing unexplained hull impacts and were deviating course northeast and requesting guidance. I did not use the word creature in that transmission. I said unexplained hull impacts of significant force, possible underwater object interaction, investigating. In those 14 minutes, I did not cut the cargo net. The net was on deck. It was not stowed. It was lying on the starboard deck aft of the midships hatch, its steel rings loose, its hemp cord piled wet and heavy from where it had been hanging in the dark above the water. Macapagal and his 4-man crew had gotten it off the cleats and onto the deck, but they had not secured it, and in the rush of the fourth event and the speed increase, and the course alteration, and the radio call, I had not given the order to secure it or to move it inboard. It was on the deck, loose, with its steel clip rings at the rail end hanging over the starboard side. Macapagal came to the bridge at 5:01 in the morning. He told me the net was on deck and asked if he should secure it to the midships bit or move it below. I told him to move it below. He went to do it. The fifth event began at 5:03. It began differently from the others. There was no gradual build-up, no tightening in the soles of the feet, no slow pressure rising through the deck. It arrived with a concussive force that I can only compare to being inside a structure when something very heavy strikes its exterior wall. The deck jumped. I went into the chart table with my hip and caught myself on the lip. Cebrero was thrown off balance at the wheel and caught the spoke with both hands. Areola at the sonar station fell from his chair. The lights in the bridge flickered. The sonar trace went to maximum and held. The return was directly beneath us at 20 feet. 20 feet, and it was not moving forward this time. It was stationary beneath us, and the hull was shaking, not with the compression wave sensation, but with actual vibration, a resonance through the plating that I felt in my back teeth and in the bones of my forearms, and that made the chart table walk on the deck by approximately 2 inches. And the cold was absolute. It was not the gradual cold of a pressure event rising from depth. It was the cold of the deep ocean translated directly through steel and deck plating into the air. a cold that had no business being in the air above the sea surface on a warm October night in the Pacific. Then it struck the starboard side. I have used the word struck because it is the closest available word, but I want to be clear that I did not hear an impact as one hears metal striking metal or a wave striking a hull. I felt it. I felt it through the deck, through the chart table, through the bones of my arms and the base of my skull. A single enormous lateral force applied to the starboard side of the vessel that heeled us to port by 12 degrees and held us there for approximately 2 seconds and then released. 2 seconds. At 12 degrees of heel with a 4,000-ton vessel, the amount of force required to hold that angle is not a force that marine biology, as I understood it in 1959, could produce. Delacroix, who had been at the starboard rail looking into the water, was thrown against the rail and caught himself. He told me afterward that in the 2 seconds the heel held, he was looking directly down into the water from the rail, and he saw, in the starlight and the faint phosphorescence of the surface, the upper surface of something broad and pale and enormously wide moving along the hull, not more than 10 or 15 feet below the waterline, moving slowly, too slowly for the force it was producing, and that what he thought he was seeing was a surface that was wider than the vessel was long. He came to the bridge immediately after the vessel righted. His face, which I knew very well, was not the face of a man who had seen something he was trying to explain. It was the face of a man who had seen something he was not going to be able to explain. He said to me, "Harold, we have to go." I said, "We are going. 14 knots, northeast." He said, "The net." I had forgotten the net. This is the decision this panel has assembled to examine, and I will give it to them without mitigation. I had forgotten the net. It was on the starboard deck. Macapagal and his crew had been in the process of moving it below when the 5th event struck, and they had been thrown, and some of them had gone to the deck, and the net was still there, on the starboard side, its steel clip rings hanging over the rail. This was a large cargo net, with a dry weight of over 400 pounds, heavy enough that its clip rings could sit against the outside of the hull and trail in the wake disturbance at our stern. It was not in the water, but it was at the rail on the side that had just been struck, and its rings were hanging outside the rail. Delacroix said the net needed to come in, and he meant immediately. I looked at the net, and I looked at the sonar, and I looked at Brennan's damage report on the bilge strake, and I made a calculation. The calculation was that the 5th event had been a strike, not a pass, and that the object, whatever it was, would need time to reposition, and that time was our window to accelerate and put distance between us and the return. I calculated that cutting speed to bring the crew on deck to move the net would cost us the momentum we needed, and that the net, being above the waterline and not in the water, did not represent the same hazard as it would have while deployed. I calculated that we had time. I was wrong. I gave the order to maintain speed. I told Delacroix we would get the net on the next calm moment. He disagreed. He said it plainly, that he disagreed, that the net needed to come in now, and I said that I understood his concern, and that we would address it in the next few minutes, and he needed to be on the bridge with me. Delacroix went to the starboard bridge wing instead of staying at the chart table. He was watching the water. He watched it for 3 minutes. He told me twice more that the net needed to come in. I told him twice more that we were maintaining speed. I was monitoring the sonar. The return had deepened slightly after the strike and was moving in a slow, wide arc to the starboard side and aft, the way a large animal in open water turns, not sharply, but with the wide, gradual arc of something whose turning radius is very large, and I was watching the arc and trying to estimate if it was a repositioning maneuver or a retreat, and the 12 minutes passed, and I made my choice, and I held it. At 5:17 in the morning, the return completed its arc and came back. It came from astern and slightly to starboard, moving fast, faster than any of the previous passes, and the compression arrived with no warning buildup. It arrived as a single pressure event of more force than any previous event. The deck jumped again, and I caught the chart table again, and Sobrero said something I did not hear, because the hull was ringing like a bell, and the sonar return was at 15 feet below the keel, and moving at a speed I estimated from the trace at close to 20 knots, and it was not moving along the vessel's length this time. It was moving directly toward the starboard quarter. I will not describe the sound of what happened next in clinical terms, because I do not think clinical terms are available. I will say that there was a sound of hemp and steel under sudden violent force, a sound that I have no analogy for, and a sound of men shouting on the starboard deck aft, and then a single very loud impact, transmitted through the hull, that was different from the hull resonance of the pressure events. A physical contact of something hard striking the exterior of the hull at the stern quarter, and the vessel yawed, perhaps 3 or 4 degrees, a real yaw. Not the heel of a pressure event, but the stern being physically pushed to port by something striking the starboard quarter. And then the sonar return was moving aft and deepening rapidly, and the hull was still. I was on the bridge wing in seconds. The starboard deck aft was clear of the net. The net was gone. The clip rings that had been hanging over the rail were gone. 2 of the deck cleats on the starboard aft rail had been pulled from their mountings, the steel cleats torn from the deck plating, and there were long parallel scrape marks in the anti-slip coating of the deck, where something very heavy had been dragged across it and over the rail. Macapagal was at the aft rail. He was looking into the water. 3 of his crew were behind him. I did not see Delacroix. I am going to pause here and ensure the transcript records a pause, because what I am about to report is the final piece of evidence regarding my first mate's death, and I want it to be accurate. I called for Delacroix by name. I called twice. Macapagal turned from the rail and looked at me without saying anything, and that told me what I needed to know. I looked at the aft deck. I looked at the rail where the cleats had been torn out. I looked at the water astern. Delacroix had been at the starboard bridge wing when I last saw him. At some point in the 2 or 3 minutes before the 5th event, he had gone down to the aft deck, I believe to move the net himself, since I would not stop the vessel to do it, and he had been there when the net went. He went with it. I am going to state for this panel the sequence of events that I have reconstructed and that I believe to be accurate, though I acknowledge I did not see it happen, and I am working from the physical evidence, and from what Macapagal told me. Macapagal was on the aft deck when the strike came. He went down when the deck yawed. When he got back to his feet, Delacroix was not there. The net was not there. The cleats were gone. Macapagal said that in the moment of the strike, he heard a sound he described as a great rushing of water, very close, on the starboard side, and a sound he said was like canvas tearing, which was the net, and a sound that was briefer, and that he would not describe in more detail than to say it was a man's voice. The sonar return diminished rapidly after the strike. It dropped below 300 feet within 10 minutes of the event, and the trace showed it moving southeast, away from our position, at a speed I could not reliably measure, but which I estimated as significantly faster than 14 knots. It did not return. We maintained maximum speed on the northeast, heading for 3 hours. At 8 in the morning, I turned back toward Colonia, on the original heading, having calculated that we were now sufficiently far from the position of the encounter that continued northeast deviation was costing us time without adding safety. We reached Colonia 12 hours later. I filed a full incident report with the Port Authority and with the Honolulu office of Pacific Consolidated Freight. I requested immediate dry dock inspection of the hull. The dry dock inspection was conducted in Manila 18 days after the event, because that was the nearest available dry facility on short notice. The inspection found the bilge strake deformation that Brennan had documented extended now over a length of approximately 30 feet. It found scoring along the keel line consistent with contact with a hard object, the kind of scoring that a rock or a reef structure would produce, except that we had not been near any reef or rock on the relevant heading. And it found, seated in a gouge in the copper keel sheathing on the starboard side approximately 20 feet forward of the stern, a tooth fragment. I want to describe this tooth fragment carefully because it has since been removed from the records. and I want my description in this deposition to stand as the only remaining documentation of it. The fragment was curved, as a tooth is curved. Its outer edge, following the curve, measured 9 inches from the base of the fragment to the broken tip, which is to say that the tip had broken off and the fragment we recovered was not the complete tooth. The width at the base was approximately 2.5 inches. The thickness at the base was approximately 1 inch. The enamel surface was intact on the outer face and was a pale cream color, slightly translucent at the edges. The serrations along the outer edge were clearly visible and were coarse, larger than those of any shark tooth I have seen in 19 years of ocean work, and I have seen many shark teeth. The base of the fragment, where it had been seated in the copper sheathing, was not the base of the tooth, but a fracture, which indicated that the complete tooth from which this fragment came was substantially larger than 9 inches along the outer edge. The shipyard foreman photographed the fragment twice with a Polaroid camera, and I was given copies of both photographs. A metallurgical specialist from the shipyard measured the fragment and noted it in the inspection log. The fragment was placed in a paper envelope and given to me by the foreman, and I kept it in the breast pocket of my jacket for the entire voyage back to Honolulu. In Honolulu, I was met by representatives of Pacific Consolidated Freight, and by 2 men I was told were from the Naval Hydrographic Office, though they did not show me formal identification, and when I subsequently contacted the Naval Hydrographic Office to confirm their identities, I was told the office had not sent anyone to meet me. These 2 men, who were courteous, and who gave me their names as Collins and Ward, which I do not believe were their actual names, asked to see my incident report and my logbooks and the sonar trace records. I showed them all of these. They asked about the dry dock inspection report, and I gave them a copy. They asked if there was any physical evidence recovered during the inspection, and I told them there was a tooth fragment, and I produced the envelope from my jacket pocket. Collins examined the tooth fragment without touching it, looking at it inside the envelope, and then he and Ward exchanged a look that I noted but said nothing about. Ward wrote in a notebook for approximately 90 seconds. Then Collins told me that they would need to take the tooth fragment for analysis and that I would receive a report in due course. I asked what organization would be analyzing it. Collins said a government marine biology laboratory, which he did not name. I asked for a receipt. He wrote one on a plain piece of paper with his name on it, the name Collins, and the date, and a description of the item. I never received a report. The receipt was not on letterhead, and the name Collins produced no result when I subsequently attempted to trace it through maritime contacts in Washington. The dry dock inspection log in Manila, which I had seen and which contained the metallurgical specialist's notes and the notation of the tooth fragment, was not in the records when I requested a copy from the shipyard 2 months later. The shipyard manager said he had no record of any tooth fragment in the inspection. The 2 Polaroid photographs were in my cabin aboard the Carrick Sound. I went back for them as soon as I realized the other records were being made to disappear. One of them was there, the other was not. I do not know who had access to my cabin in the time between my meeting with Collins and Ward and my return to the vessel. The photograph that remained showed the tooth fragment in the envelope, the curve of it clearly visible, and the serrations along the outer edge. I have this photograph in my possession. It is the only physical evidence I have retained. I have submitted this photograph to the inquest as Exhibit A, and I trust this panel has examined it. Now I want to address the question that I understand this inquest was partly convened to examine, which is the question of what I believe we encountered. I am going to be precise about this, because I am aware that precision in this context is more credible than assertion. What I observed directly, a sonar returned significantly wider than my vessel, moving at depth and responding to our course and speed changes. A waterline displacement longer than my vessel's 214 feet. 3 pressure events of escalating intensity transmitted through the hull and felt physically by multiple crew members. One event severe enough to heal a 4,200-ton vessel to 12 degrees and hold it there for 2 seconds. An inward deformation of the bilge strake consistent with sustained lateral pressure against the hull exterior. A surface disturbance with a diameter of 80 to 100 feet, observed in flat, calm conditions. A shape at the surface, briefly visible by starlight, that appeared to be wider than my vessel's beam of 32 feet. A tooth fragment of approximately 9 or more inches along the outer curve, with coarse serrations, recovered from a gouge in my copper keel sheathing. What I did not observe directly, the animal itself in sufficient clarity to make a species identification. I am not going to make a species identification in this deposition. I will note for the record that a tooth fragment of 9 inches along the outer edge with coarse serrations, recovered from a gouge in a steel-reinforced copper keel, is not consistent with any shark species currently recognized as living in the Central Pacific, and that the dimensions of the sonar return and the waterline displacement are not consistent with any living marine animal described in the scientific literature available to me. I will note these things and I will leave the identification to the panel's experts, because I am a ship captain and not a marine biologist. What I will say, and what I want in this record, is that whatever we encountered on the 14th and 15th and 16th of October, 1959, in the waters northwest of Pohnpei, was alive. It was large. It was purposeful. It followed us. It struck us. And its behavior in the hours between the first event and the final event showed a pattern of escalation that I can only describe as strategic, because it began at depth with pressure waves, came progressively closer with each pass, struck the hull on the fifth event and displaced us laterally, and then made its final approach from astern at high speed, targeting the deployed equipment on the starboard aft deck. I do not know if it was targeting the net specifically or targeting the starboard quarter generally. I do not know if the net, hanging over the rail in the dark, was the thing that attracted its final approach to that location. I know that Macapagal asked me to bring the net all the way aboard, and I did not do it. I know that Delacroix asked me to bring the net in on at least 2 occasions before the final event, and I did not do it. I know that I had 12 minutes between the 5th event and the final event in which I could have brought the net in, and that I made a different calculation, and that Raymond Delacroix is not alive to give his own testimony to this inquest because of that calculation. I want the panel to have that clearly and without equivocation. I have not offered this information to anyone before this deposition. I have given my incident report, which described the loss of the first mate as occurring during a hull impact event, and that report is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go far enough. The complete truth is that I made a decision not to stop the vessel and secure the net when I had the opportunity to do so, that I made this decision twice in 12 minutes, that Delacroix was on the aft deck attempting to deal with the net when the final event occurred because I had not stopped the vessel for him, and that he died as a direct consequence of my decision to prioritize speed over that action. I do not know how to say that more plainly. I have tried to find a formulation for 17 months that was accurate, without being a confession, and I have not found one, because the accurate formulation is a confession, and what I am here to give is an accurate formulation. I would like to return now to the period immediately following the event, and to provide the panel with the remaining factual record of the voyage. When I confirmed that Delacroix was not on the vessel, I ordered an immediate search of all accessible areas below decks, which was completed in 40 minutes. He was not aboard. I logged his loss at 5:31 in the morning on the 16th of October, and transmitted the loss notification to Honolulu on the emergency frequency. I also transmitted a navigation advisory on the standard marine broadcast frequency warning vessels of an unidentified large submerged object in the region of our encounter, providing our position at the time of the events and the approximate track of the object based on the sonar record. I do not know if this advisory was acted upon by other vessels in the area. The crew was in a state I can only describe as functional shock. Macapagal took charge of his deck crew and kept them occupied. Brennan ran continuous hull monitoring for the remainder of the voyage. Sobrero held the wheel for 6 hours without asking for a relief. Ariola, at the sonar, remained at his station until I sent him to rest at 7 in the morning. These men performed their duties under circumstances that were beyond the scope of anything their professional training had prepared them for, and I want that noted. We reached Colonia without further incident. The sonar showed nothing unusual for the remainder of the transit. The water temperature returned to normal within 2 hours of the final event. I do not have an explanation for the temperature behavior other than the one I have already offered, which is that it was consistent with the presence of a very large mass of cold, deep water brought to the surface by the movement of a very large animal. In Colonia, I met with the port captain, a man named Isidore Torres, and I gave him my full account. He listened without interruption, and then told me that in the preceding 18 months, 3 vessels operating on routes between the Caroline Islands and Guam had reported similar experiences: pressure events, hull vibrations, large sonar returns, unusual waterline displacement, and that one of those vessels, a fishing trawler of about 80 tons, had not reached port and had been listed as lost with all hands, in weather that, when I checked the meteorological record, had not been particularly severe. Torres said that the fishing communities in the outer islands had been saying for 2 years that there was something very large in the waters between Pohnpei and Guam, and that they had been largely dismissing it as fishermen's stories. He said he was not going to dismiss it anymore. I asked Torres if the fishing communities had a name for it. He told me they did, but he said the name in the local language, and I did not retain it with enough accuracy to reproduce it here. He said that the word, roughly translated, meant something like the great shadow that precedes the deep, which is not a translation I can verify, but which struck me as consistent with the leading behavior I had observed on the sonar, the way the return had positioned itself ahead of us on our heading and maintained that position. I have thought about that behavior more than I have thought about almost anything else connected to this event. Why lead us? The animal, if we accept that it was an animal with purposeful behavior, struck us on the 5th event from astern, not from ahead. It did not lead us toward anything specific in the time it was ahead of us. We were in open ocean. There was no reef, no coast, no navigational feature in our direction of travel. It led us, and then it turned and struck from behind. I do not know what to make of that pattern. It may have been feeding behavior, herding behavior of a kind I cannot understand. It may have been something else entirely. I offer this observation not as a conclusion, but as a fact that I want in the record, because I think the behavior tells us something about the animal that I am not qualified to interpret. The question I have been asked most frequently, by the people who have had some knowledge of this incident and who have spoken to me about it, is whether I believe the animal was a Carcharocles megalodon, the large shark species generally considered to have been extinct for approximately 2 million years. I will answer this question directly because I think the question itself is a distraction from what matters in this deposition, which is the death of Raymond Delacroix and the decisions that contributed to it. But I will answer it. I cannot make that identification from what I observed. I can say that the tooth fragment I recovered is not consistent with any living shark species, and is consistent in its morphology with the descriptions I have since read of Megalodon dentition. I can say that the size of the sonar return and the waterline displacement are consistent with what the scientific literature describes as the estimated size of Megalodon specimens, which range from 40 to 60 feet in length, though some estimates go higher. I can say that the behavior I observed, a large predatory animal following and testing and finally striking a vessel, is consistent with what one might expect from an ambush predator of very large size encountering a novel and moving object in its territory. I can also say that I spent 17 years being a precise and rational man, and that I sat in a naval hydrographic office in Honolulu and heard a man tell me that a sonar return showing a 60 to 80 foot wide mass moving purposefully and responding to our course changes was probably a deep scattering layer artifact, and I nodded and thanked him for his time, because I was still trying to have an available explanation, and I no longer have that luxury. There is something in the water northwest of Pohnpei that should not exist. I saw its tooth. I felt it through steel and deck plating and the soles of my boots. I watched the ocean climb my hull as it passed beneath me. I watched a sonar return match my course and speed through multiple changes and then come at us from astern at 20 knots and take my net and take my first mate into the Pacific Ocean at 5:17 in the morning. I do not know if it is a megalodon. I know what it is not. It is not a submarine artifact. It is not a scattering layer. It is not a pod of whales. It is not anything I have a clean explanation for. And I know that Raymond Delacroix's daughters are 7 and 5 years old now, and that they do not have a father, and that the reason they do not have a father is in part the 14 minutes I spent making a different calculation. That is what I have to tell this panel. I am prepared to answer questions. I want to add one final statement before the formal question period, because I think it belongs in this record, even if it is not technically part of the factual account. When the thing was directly beneath us on the 5th event, when the deck was shaking and the sonar was pegged, and the cold was coming through the plating into the air of the bridge, I looked at the sonar screen, and I had a single clear thought, the kind of thought that arrives complete and fully formed in the moment of greatest clarity, which is that the thing beneath me had been in that ocean for a very long time, far longer than any of the vessel classes that had traversed those waters, far longer than the routes those vessels sailed, far longer than the industry that built them, or the commerce they served, and that it did not know what we were or care what we were, and that its engagement with us was not personal and not particular, and that nothing about that made it less dangerous. In fact, the absence of the personal was the thing that frightened me most. A thing that large, that old, that capable, with no interest in us as anything other than a disturbance in its water, striking us because we were there, and making noise and trailing things in its ocean. I have not been to sea since I surrendered my master's papers in February of 1960. I am 39 years old. I had intended to sail until I could not. I do not intend to go back. This has nothing to do with fear in the way that word is usually meant. I am not afraid of the ocean. I am not afraid of the dark. I am afraid of making another calculation that costs someone their life. And I do not trust myself at the master's position on any vessel in those waters, after what happened to Delacroix. And that is the truth I am leaving this inquest with. The photograph of the tooth fragment is Exhibit A. I have kept it in my wallet since the day I found the second photograph missing from my cabin. I am not surrendering it to this inquest. I will allow it to be copied and I will allow the copy to be entered into evidence, but the original stays with me. It is the only proof I have that any of this happened, and it is the only proof that Raymond Delacroix's daughters will ever have that their father's death was not an ordinary accident at sea. I would like that to be true. I would like them to know that he did not die in a routine incident on a routine voyage. He died on a ship that had been struck by something that should not exist, in waters that something very old and very large considers its own, and he died at least in part because he went down to the deck to do what I had not stopped the vessel to let his crew do, and because he was that kind of man, the kind who goes down to the deck himself when the thing needs doing. Margaret Delacroix should know that. I have not told her because I have not been able to say it aloud until this morning, and I understand that what I have said this morning will have consequences for my professional standing, and possibly for my legal standing, and I accept that. I accepted it before I came here. What I am not prepared to accept, and what I have not been able to accept for 17 months, is the silence. The records that disappeared from Manila. The men who were not from the Naval Hydrographic Office. The transmission I made on the marine broadcast frequency that I cannot confirm was ever acted on. The trawler that went missing in weather that was not severe. There are people who know more than I do about what is in that water, and they have chosen to manage that knowledge in ways I do not have access to and cannot influence. I do not have a remedy for that. I have this deposition, and I have the photograph, and I have the names of Raymond Delacroix's daughters. And this morning those three things are what I have to put against 17 months of silence. Claire, Iris. Their father went to the deck because something needed doing, and he was that kind of man. That is my full account.